Revenge with Karen.
Your diploma isn't essential, sweetheart, Greg said, chewing his gum like it owed him rent. My son's taking over next quarter anyway. We need someone who actually understands today's systems. Not the stuff you learned in your Ivy Tower 10 years ago. That was the first time he said it out loud, in front of a full conference room. Finance, HR, marketing, hell, even two guys from facilities heard it. Nobody laughed. Nobody said a damn thing either. Just the low hum of fluorescent lights and the dull tap of Greg's silver pen bouncing off the table like a cheap metronome counting down the seconds until the next insult. Karen sat there still. Not frozen, still, like the eye of a hurricane. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, legs crossed at the ankle, that scar on her left thumb catching a bit of light from the window. Gotten it rewiring a legacy system alone at 1 a.m. during a merger panic 2 years back. No one remembered that. Not Greg, not Brett, not any of the strategic visionaries now crowding the boardroom with their vape pens and reusable water bottles shaped like dumbbells. But she remembered, and she remembered this too. She didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached for her notepad, clicked her pen once and under the table, clicked record on the innocuous-looking keychain she always kept clipped to her laptop bag. Company policy said nothing about personal keychains. And as Greg launched into another tirade about how agility meant ignoring Gantt charts and just vibing with it, Karen calmly made another little tick mark in the margin of her notes, like she was counting ants at a picnic. It had started subtly at first. A sarcastic thanks, Professor, when she presented a 3-tier risk mitigation structure for the vendor migration. A joke during a quarterly all-hands about how Karen probably uses a typewriter at home. And that one Slack message, God, the Slack message, where Greg replied too long, didn't read to a 3-sentence compliance brief. She reported that one to HR. They thanked her for raising visibility and logged it for internal reference. Translation: absolutely nothing happened. It wasn't just words. The quiet cuts came next. Access restrictions. Calendar invites where her name got accidentally left off. A sudden audit of her department's budget, flagged as bloated even though she'd come in 15% under for the last 3 fiscal years. Then came the reorg proposal. Cross-functional streamlining, Greg called it. He'd stuck her between procurement and legal in a new structure called operational enablement. Sounded fancy, meant nothing. She was now 5 steps removed from anything that actually mattered. But she took the title change with a nod. Director of Systems Strategy became Process Lead Legacy Oversight. Someone asked what that meant. Greg shrugged and said, she's the janitor for the old stuff. She didn't fight it. Not then. Because the thing about systems, real systems, not the PowerPoint ones, is that they don't collapse all at once. They rot slowly, quietly. You don't notice until the basement floods and the power's out, and suddenly you're screaming at a fuse box you never bothered to label. Karen was the label. For 9 years, she'd been the duct tape and steel mesh holding the digital spine of the company together. She didn't make noise about it. She didn't schmooze or lunch and learn or use phrases like scalable synergy. When the 2019 transition from Legacy Secure to OmniPath nearly blew up the customer data archive, she was the one who saved it on a Sunday, with no overtime, in sandals, using a half-dead VPN and 1 string of emergency shell commands that shouldn't have even worked. Now, she watched Greg swing his new title around like a drunk with a sledgehammer, mocking her process diagrams in front of his son Brett. Hadn't written a line of code in his life, but had the audacity to say, Karen, I think you're just scared of innovation. Scared? No, sweetheart. Scared was sitting in her apartment in 2015 praying a security patch wouldn't brick the mainframe over the holiday weekend because the only other person who could have helped was in Mexico and off the grid. This was theater, and she was writing the script quietly behind the scenes. After each public humiliation, Karen didn't cry, didn't rage. She copied files. She printed backups. She documented change logs. She reviewed employee manuals. She cross-checked clauses. She made sure her signature wasn't on anything new, nothing Greg could pin to her once the glue holding his empire started to melt. And she scheduled something. A memo. A small, predated compliance packet. One that would email itself to the chairman of the board, automatically, under one specific condition, if the project lead was changed within 2 weeks of a critical submission. She had timed it like a landmine, not because she was vindictive, not because she wanted blood, but because she'd been called irrelevant. And the system she designed, the one Greg called cluttered, it didn't care about his title. It didn't care who his son was. It cared about sequence, and timelines, and consequences. Karen just made sure someone would hear the click before the boom. It happened on a Thursday. Rain had slicked the parking lot like a layer of oil, and Karen had arrived early, 6:43 a.m., like always. By 8:12, she was sitting in conference room C with a lukewarm coffee and a printed quarterly roadmap folded in her lap like a surrender flag she had no intention of waving. Greg strutted in 4 minutes late, eyes bloodshot like he'd either been drinking or congratulating himself in front of a mirror all night. HR trailed behind him, a woman named Mel who used to lead diversity training and now spent most of her days pretending Greg's decisions made sense. Greg didn't sit, just leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed over a new button-down that still had a visible crease from the packaging. He smiled like a man who believed he was doing her a favor. Going in a different direction, he said. Karen blinked once, slowly. Greg continued, it's not personal, of course. You've done good work, really, but we're trying to modernize, be more adaptive, and frankly, we need someone who speaks the language of now. Mel shifted uncomfortably. She had a clipboard, a packet stapled with Karen's name in thick blue Sharpie. It had the smell of something rehearsed and disinfected. Karen looked up. Who's replacing me? Greg didn't hesitate. Brett, she stared at him. No expression, no raised eyebrows, no twitch of the mouth. Greg misread the silence as approval. He's young, hungry, full of ideas. The kind of fresh perspective the board's been begging for. Karen didn't remind him the board had never asked for anything of the sort. She didn't mention that Brett, at last count, had abandoned 2 startups, flunked out of his MBA program, and once asked her if SSL was a kind of sandwich. Instead, she looked at Mel. Is this effective immediately? Mel nodded like she'd practiced it in the mirror that morning. Yes, but we're giving you the rest of the day to gather your things. Greg was kind enough to waive the 2-week transition period. How generous, Karen said flatly, voice like frost forming on a window. She stood, slow and precise. Not a single movement wasted. Her bag was already packed under the table. Her laptop, charger, notebooks, 1 manila folder marked Q4 Architecture, backup. She handed over her badge. Not to Greg, to Mel, deliberately. Greg gave a final flourish. No hard feelings, right? And if you ever want to consult, maybe help Brett onboard. Karen looked at him with the kind of quiet that made people sweat in silence. He'll be fine, she said. I'm sure he knows exactly what he's doing. And then she left. She didn't go back to her desk. He didn't make a farewell post on Slack. She didn't cry in the stairwell or hug anyone goodbye. She walked straight to the parking garage, climbed into her aging Volvo, and sat with her hands on the wheel for exactly 3 minutes. No music, no tears, just the soft ping of a notification on her phone. One message. Sent. Compliance packet queued, 13 days remaining until transfer lock. It was an automated system she'd built herself during the vendor overhaul in March. Buried in the compliance framework, it was designed to create a chain of accountability if leadership changed during key transition phases. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even secret. Just technical, specific, overlooked because nobody reads the fine print of their own safety nets. She'd attached her final submission to it the night before. And in the quiet dark of her apartment, she triple-checked the timer. If the lead on that project changed hands within 14 business days, the packet would trigger an addendum clause. That clause would send a full report, including financial exposure estimates and leadership reassignment flags, to the board's compliance liaison and, by default, to the chairman's assistant. Greg hadn't read it. Of course he hadn't. He'd called her too academic while she wrote the procedural scaffolding that made his job possible, laughed at her documentation while building his empire on systems she alone understood. Now he was flying blind and proud of it. At 3:08 p.m., she pulled off the highway and into the self-storage lot where she kept her backup drives. She wasn't paranoid. She was methodical. 3 copies. 1 cloud encrypted, 1 cold storage, 1 analog archive. She removed the flash drive from her glove compartment and checked the label. Sierra Stack. Final config. She didn't need it, but it felt good to hold something solid. Later that evening, she declined every call from former colleagues, ignored 2 LinkedIn messages and 3 texts from Mel that started with just checking in. She poured herself a glass of wine, opened her laptop, and removed herself from every admin panel she'd ever touched. Then she sat back, opened a blank text document, and titled it simply, Transfer of Liability, Contingency Notes. She didn't know when they'd realize what they'd done, but they would. Brett showed up Monday wearing sneakers with no socks and a blazer that still had the stitched brand label running down the sleeve. He strolled into the operations wing like he was auditioning for a Hulu startup drama. First thing he did, unplugged Karen's dual monitor setup and replaced it with his MacBook and a scented candle. No joke. Vanilla Bean. Lit it right there in front of IT. Called an impromptu meeting at 10:07 a.m. Alignment jam, he called it. All right, Brett said, feet on Karen's old desk. We're killing all that legacy crap. If you can't explain a system to me in under 60 seconds, it's too complicated. Simplicity is innovation. He gave everyone 24 hours to submit bullet point summaries of their workflows. Not one of them had fewer than 3 critical dependencies tied to Karen's retired system stack. Brett didn't read them. He skimmed the first page of each, slapped a post-it on it that said TBD, and threw them in a recycled Amazon box under his desk. He canceled the biweekly vendor review call, claimed it was a waste of time. Told procurement they'd just rebuild contracts from scratch if we need to. When IT asked about the compliance packet scheduled for final review next week, he waved his hand. We'll figure it out. Just streamline it. Wednesday, accounts payable froze 2 contractor invoices, missing metadata. Brett accused the finance software of being outdated. When IT explained that Karen had maintained those permissions manually through a layered override system, Brett responded, yeah, we don't do override matrices anymore. I trust people. The system stopped trusting him back almost immediately. 2 engineers had their access revoked due to mismatched credentials during a system refresh. Sandbox environment got wiped. Customer support flagged a weird surge of ticket duplication from the new AutoTag integration Brett approved without review. He blamed Karen's labyrinths. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of suburban silence, Karen sat on her back porch, laptop closed, reading a paperback novel. The rain tapped against the roof like a slow countdown. Every once in a while, her phone buzzed. She didn't respond, but she read everything. Text from Devin, her former deputy. They lost the master schema. Brett said we don't need it. What does that even mean? Email from the facilities manager. Just FYI, Brett tried to override the badge system, and now none of the execs can access the secure floor. Security's pissed. Slack DM from Angela in legal via a personal burner account. Did you leave anything behind to help us? He's deleting config files like it's Minesweeper. Karen didn't reply. She did open her OneDrive and check the access logs. Brett had already tried to open the private documentation folder she'd wiped clean before leaving. Twice. At 1:42 a.m. and 1:57 a.m. on Sunday morning. Panic always arrives between midnight and sunrise. Thursday afternoon, Brett posted a company-wide update. Subject line, Rocket New Era Begins. The email read like a pitch deck. Team, streamlining processes and leaving outdated complexities in the past. Expect faster rollouts, leaner workflows, and a more empowered culture. Questions? Send them to my assistant. His assistant was a 23-year-old sorority sister named Kenzie, who once asked Karen how to convert a PDF into a regular Word doc you can emoji in. She promptly forwarded all technical questions to Brett's junk folder. No answers came. By Friday, IT ran a security audit. Not standard procedure, just a cautious pulse check because something felt off. The audit returned 2 yellow flags and 1 red. When presented with the findings, Brett squinted at the report and said, Is this like a firewall thing? The IT lead, Mike, who'd been at the company longer than Greg, called Karen. He didn't ask questions. He didn't complain. He just said, you might want to keep your drive backed up. He responded with a single line, 4 days left. Mike didn't ask what that meant, but he did start copying his own documentation onto a personal stick drive, one of those old silver ones from a trade show in 2011. Internally, people started whispering. Not in meetings, nobody wanted to get flagged, but in kitchen corners, behind locked Slack channels, and via old group texts that hadn't been used since the Q3 offsite 3 years ago. Something was unraveling, slowly, but undeniably, and Brett. He was still talking about installing a foosball table. It was quiet. That specific kind of corporate quiet that hums just beneath the surface, where people still show up, still hold meetings, still send calendar invites, but everyone's looking at each other like they're waiting for a fuse to burn down behind the drywall. On Tuesday morning, compliance officer named Janice did something dangerous. She followed protocol. She wasn't a troublemaker. She wore cardigans with little bird prints and color-coded her folders. But she'd been on Karen's Phase 2 regulatory team during the initial compliance transition, and she knew there was a federal review scheduled for the following Thursday. Karen had called it the blackout line. Once crossed, every file, process, approval would have to meet the 2024 Integrity Audit Standard. No exceptions. No grandfathering. It was designed to prevent exposure after Q3 restructuring, a federal band-aid after that vendor incident last year that nearly tanked their liability coverage. Janice sent the email to Greg at 8:01 a.m. Subject: Regulatory Phase 2 Review Date Confirmation. She attached the tracking sheet Karen had built, highlighted the pending fields, added a polite note. Would Brett or someone else be presenting the documentation previously prepped by Karen? Just want to ensure we're on track. Greg never answered. Brett did. At 10:36 a.m., Janice received a response that simply read, "We're good. Don't need that dinosaur process anymore. We're running agile now. No greeting, no sign-off, just that." Janice read it twice, blinked, and flagged the message. She didn't reply. Instead, she printed it and slid it into the back of her just-in-case file, the same folder where she kept screenshots of outdated training modules and vendor NDA inconsistencies. HR had once called her paranoid. Karen had called her thorough. She preferred Karen's word. That same afternoon, 3 independent contractors, network specialists from Apex Delta, walked off the job. No pay for 29 days. They'd submitted invoices. Twice, finance claimed they were missing escalation tags. But those tags had been part of Karen's now-deleted workflow, and Brett had told finance to stop babying the third-party clowns. In the exit email from the Apex Delta lead, there was a single line under the sign-off. "This is not a Karen problem. This is a leadership decision problem." The phrase got screenshotted and passed around internal chats like a meme. Meanwhile, in a house with thick curtains and zero corporate lighting, Karen received a text. From Devin, they just ignored the Phase 2 flag. "Janice is about to have a heart attack." Karen didn't reply, but she pulled up her calendar. 3:00 p.m., an event labeled Lunch with Dad clicked over to Completed. At that exact time, in a quiet, unassuming server center in Boston, an automated compliance daemon triggered a scheduled mail queue. A file compiled 3 weeks earlier, embedded with a timestamp, began its journey through secured channels. Karen had named it harmlessly Q3 Audit Notice Alt Route PDF and embedded it within a nested compliance thread previously marked inactive. The system didn't know politics. It didn't care about Brett or Greg or who was or wasn't attending alignment jams. It just knew 2 things. Karen's name had been removed from the compliance chain within the protected window. Replacement had been assigned with no attached Phase 2 completion tag. At 3:08 p.m., the board's shared compliance inbox received an email titled, "Change of Project Owner Contingency Notice Regulatory Phase 2. Attached was a 17-page memorandum. The first line read, "Per procedural clause 9b under internal regulatory policy, #2237F. Please note the triggering of the liability transfer window due to reassignment within the protected timeframe. See signature validation on page 6. This action places accountability for Phase 2 on the initiating executive party." At the bottom of page 17 was a single line signed digitally by Karen. "Final submission timestamped per Section 5B compliant with 14-day lock protocol. Audit fallback engaged." The message was silent. No fireworks, no alarms, just a soft digital arrival into an inbox nobody checked hourly, except the chairman's assistant, who read everything twice. Back in the office, Brett was redesigning the internal dashboard. "Less clutter," he said, removing a column called Compliance Checkpoints and replacing it with a live GIF of a progress bar that looped endlessly at 97%. Someone in finance asked if they should wait for updated protocols before cutting the next contractor checks. "Nah," Brett shrugged. Karen's system was always overkill. In the server logs, another silent event ticked over. Phase 2, compliance owner null. Karen was gardening when Devin texted again. This time, he didn't bother with pleasantries. "Karen, did you do something?" She stared at the message, dirt under her nails, a single cucumber half buried in the raised bed. She typed one word, "Yes." Then she muted the thread. The email came through at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday. Subject line, quarterly review, board audit attendance confirmed. There it was, clear as day. Chairman Harold Wexler will attend in person. Greg nearly fell out of his overpriced ergonomic chair. "This is it," he whispered, half to himself and half to the Bluetooth speaker playing lo-fi beats in the corner of his office. "I'm to show the board what real operational transformation looks like." He burst into the operations bullpen like a marching band, clapping his hands together like a little league coach. "Team," he shouted, "the chairman himself is coming next Friday. We are going to dazzle the living hell out of them." Brett, lounging in Karen's old chair with his feet up and a Red Bull sweating beside a stress ball, smirked. "Redefining the entire structure, baby," he said, throwing finger guns at the HR intern. "Legacy's out. Agile's in." Greg chuckled, then turned to Angela from legal. "Can you make sure our presentation includes that new dashboard Brett rolled out?" Angela blinked. "The one with the looping progress bar?" "Exactly," Greg nodded, missing the sarcasm. "It's modern, minimalist. We want them to feel innovation." In the corner, Devin said nothing, just adjusted the files in his lap, and quietly emailed a copy of Karen's last audit draft to himself. BCing it to a non-corporate address with the subject line, "Just in case, final version." The planning meetings ramped up fast. Greg scheduled 2 strategy showcases and a synergy jam to get the exec team aligned on messaging. Karen's name still appeared on the official agenda for the audit, Phase 2 transition lead, Karen Liu, which was automatically pulled from last quarter's compliance filings. Greg crossed it out manually. Red Sharpie, all caps replaced B. Gregory. Brett leaned over his shoulder and grinned. "Think they'll ask about her?" Greg snorted. "Please, Wexler's old school. He wants results, not resumes. We're about to give him a vision he can actually understand." Behind them, Devin quietly made a note in his planner. Karen still listed in system as project lead. For the next few days, Brett practiced his presentation voice, adding phrases like disruption architecture and horizontal transformation, even though he didn't know what either meant. He told marketing to print new department posters that read "Welcome to Ops 2.0." He replaced the team's Slack icon with a pixelated rocket ship and had a temporary tattoo of a QR code printed for the interns to wear at the meeting. "To make us look tech-forward," he said. Operations became a theme park of bad ideas. At one point, Brett insisted on removing 2 compliance checkpoint slides from the deck because charts make people nervous. He replaced them with a blurry stock photo of a handshake and the caption, "Building trust, not barriers." Someone in the back whispered, "We're dead." Meanwhile, the systems kept hiccuping. On Thursday, a critical vendor integration flagged a compatibility error with the new database. Procurement asked Brett if he'd reviewed the final specs before the Phase 2 rollover. He shrugged. "That's what automation's for. I'm not here to babysit CSV files." Devin said nothing, but he opened Karen's final changelog and cross-referenced it with the project repository. A signature field was blank. Brett had approved a database migration without submitting the Phase 2 compliance form. Back in the planning room, Greg was high on his own fumes. Lead with vision, then let Brett walk them through the new streamlined logic. After that, finance can back us up with cost savings, and legal can hit him with risk reduction. Angela from legal stared at him. "We haven't reduced any risk. In fact, some of it, Angela," Greg cut her off. "Just stay in the lane. Wexler doesn't want a lecture. He wants momentum." Then came the kicker. Brett added a new slide at the end of the deck. Photo of him and Greg at Cleveland Browns game with the caption, "Father-son leadership, future-proofing the company." Nobody laughed. Nobody objected. They were too tired. Too numb. Devin watched it all unfold with a cold sort of detachment, like someone watching a man rearrange furniture on a balcony with no railings. On the day before the audit, Janice from compliance walked into the break room, pale as drywall. "Removed the fail-safe protocol from the mainframe," she whispered. Devin looked up. "Karen's clause," she said, voice barely audible. "The one in her final memo, it's live. And if the chairman brings up Phase 2, Devin already knew." He walked back to his desk, opened his private inbox, and saw the message waiting from Karen. No subject, no signature. Just one sentence, "Don't interfere. Just observe." The audit was scheduled for 9:00 a.m. Friday. Greg had his suit pressed. Brett rehearsed his opening joke in the mirror, and somewhere on a server none of them understood, a file waited, quiet, time-stamped, and locked. Friday morning, 8:55 a.m. The conference room had that manufactured chill, half AC, half nerves. The blinds were drawn, the projector screen humming softly. Someone had arranged branded water bottles in front of each seat like centerpieces for a corporate funeral. First came legal. Angela, lips pressed so tightly together they were practically inverted. Then finance, two senior analysts who hadn't smiled since 2017 and who now sat with their laptops closed, arms crossed, as if preparing for war by staying still. HR showed up with coffee they didn't drink. A couple of engineers were dragged in last-minute, quiet, sharp-eyed types who never spoke unless something was really broken. Their presence wasn't a good sign. At 9:02, Brett breezed in with a grin and a clicker in hand, wearing a powder blue blazer over a Henley shirt. Greg followed close behind, chest puffed, radiating smugness like cologne. They both looked like they'd just walked off the set of a recruitment ad. All right, Greg clapped his hands. Let's kick this off. Brett, take it away. Brett stepped up to the podium, clicked the remote, and the first slide popped up. Ops 2.0, redefining the structure of now. Silence. Morning, everyone, Brett started, his voice louder than necessary. We've had a groundbreaking quarter. We've rebuilt our operational core from the ground up, leaner, smarter, cleaner. Slide 2, a Venn diagram where none of the circles overlapped. We've eliminated the legacy overhead, Brett continued, and moved our core architecture onto a more modern system. He glanced at his notes. The OmniPath, Sierra stack platform. Angela raised her head slowly. You mean the legacy secure overlay? Brett blinked. No, we scrapped that. Karen's system, too cluttered. Devin, seated in the corner, didn't move, but he uncapped a pen very quietly. Brett clicked to the next slide, a list of acronyms. We've optimized SLA compliance by integrating with the DRP. The RDP framework. Do you mean DRC? One of the finance analysts interrupted. Disaster recovery compliance. Right? Yeah, Brett said, waving a hand. That. But we don't need that anymore, not with our current uptime model. Angela's lips finally moved. You eliminated the disaster recovery protocol. Well, yeah. We've had 99.9% uptime for 3 quarters. The risk is minimal. The engineers exchanged a look that said, he just said that out loud. Greg stepped in, sensing blood in the water. Let's not get bogged down in the technicals. What Brett's trying to say is, we've moved beyond Karen's old system. She did great work, of course, but it was slow. Bureaucratic. We're in a new era. He clicked ahead to a slide showing a photo of Brett standing next to a server rack, holding a whiteboard marker like a weapon. Transformation, Greg declared, is uncomfortable. But it's necessary. Someone coughed. No one laughed. Projector fans sounded like it was straining to escape the room. A question came from finance. Have the vendor invoices been reconciled for the Apex Delta migration? Brett hesitated. We're streamlining vendor relations. Some of those invoices are on hold for optimization. Angela frowned. Didn't Apex Delta walk off 2 weeks ago? Devin leaned forward slightly in his chair. Greg interjected again, voice louder. Listen, it's not about who left or stayed. It's about what we've gained, freedom from over-engineered bureaucracy. We're no longer beholden to outdated systems. Another engineer spoke, very softly. Karen's system had the audit flags pre-configured. Are those still running? Brett opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Greg. Greg smiled too widely. We've replaced those with a more intuitive system. Self-regulating, more efficient. A second later, the screen behind them glitched. The slide disappeared. Blue desktop background flickered on screen with one lone folder labeled MTG Assets Final. Angela rubbed her temples. The room was quiet except for the rhythmic hum of the HVAC and Brett clicking the remote uselessly. I think we lost the deck, he said. No one moved. Then, almost in slow motion, Devin reached into his bag, pulled out a printed agenda, and flipped it to page 2. He tapped the header. Chairman's segment is next, he said. Greg checked his watch. He's running late, probably got held up. He's never late, Angela said, not looking up. Then came the sound of a door handle turning. The room collectively inhaled, and then it opened. The door creaked open with all the gravity of a courtroom verdict. Everyone turned, necks craning instinctively, like schoolkids caught gossiping mid-lecture. In stepped Chairman Harold Wexler, gray suit, no tie, leather folio under one arm. Rain still beating along the shoulders of his jacket like he'd walked through a storm and hadn't noticed. He didn't speak right away. He just looked around the room, scanning each face like he was confirming who'd be remembered when the dust settled. His eyes landed briefly on Brett, then longer on Greg. Then, finally, on the empty seat at the far end of the table. Karen's seat, the one that still had her nameplate because nobody thought or dared to remove it. He frowned. There's Karen, no hello, no preamble, just that. Greg, already halfway into a standing posture, chuckled awkwardly and tugged at his collar. Karen, he gave a theatrical shrug. She's moved on, decided to pursue other opportunities. My son, Brett, is leading operations now. Brett gave a half wave like he was being introduced on a game show. Excited to bring some fresh blood to the team, sir. Chairman Wexler didn't return the gesture. He blinked slowly. Once, went still. Wexler stepped forward, placed the leather folio on the table with surgical precision, and opened it. From inside, he removed a single, folded packet of paper. Not digital, not emailed, printed. It made a faint, whispering sound as it slid across the table. He looked at Greg. His voice, when it came, was not loud, not stern, just deliberate. Do you know what this is? Greg cleared his throat. Well, no, but if it's about Karen's exit, that was. Wexler held up one hand, not a dramatic gesture. Just 2 fingers raised. Greg stopped talking. The chairman turned the memo around so the room could see the header. Change of project owner contingency notice regulatory phase 2. Devin blinked. Angela sat bolt upright. Brett squinted like he was trying to decipher a foreign language written in blood. Wexler flipped the first page without looking down. This landed in the board's compliance inbox 2 days ago. Timed delivery from Karen Liu. Greg's face didn't fall, it melted like wax. His jaw slackened. Wait, what is that? Some old report? No, Wexler said, tapping the paper. It's a regulatory tripwire, a failsafe, built into the compliance schedule for phase 2. It states that if the project lead is reassigned within 14 business days of the final compliance submission, all accountability transfers to the initiating executive. Permanently. Angela was already typing. The engineers didn't move. Janice from compliance slowly crossed herself under the table. Greg laughed again, but it cracked at the end. That can't be binding. She's not even here, and legal signed off on the restructure. Wexler raised an eyebrow. Did they sign this? He flipped to page 6. Angela stopped typing. Oh my God, there it was. Signature, timestamp, validation code, internal legal sign-off. Greg looked to Brett. His credit was finally speechless. Wexler pushed the document across the table until it sat directly in front of Greg. I'm going to ask again, the chairman said, his voice now a notch colder. Where's Karen? Greg opened his mouth, closed it, searched the room like someone drowning looks for air. We let her go. I thought. He trailed off. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was surgical. Wexler straightened up. You thought you understood her value. Thought if she didn't shout, she didn't matter. But she wasn't building systems. She was building containment, guardrails, firewalls, and you pulled her out mid-flight. Greg stepped back, his face losing color. Nobody told me. Wexler cut him off with a look, not angry, just done. From his jacket pocket, the chairman pulled out a small phone, tapped the screen once, then looked to Angela. Please call an executive session, he said calmly. Now. Angela stood up, already dialing. Greg turned to Brett, whispering, fix this. But Brett just stared at the memo, his lips moving slightly like he was trying to sound out the words. Transfer of accountability, initiating executive, Gregory D. Alton. Wexler didn't wait for another excuse. He turned, walked to the window, and looked out at the parking lot. The whole room was frozen in that breath before the crash moment. And then, almost softly, he said, people really thought Karen was the dinosaur. He shook his head. No, she was the firewall. The door hadn't even fully clicked shut from Angela's departure before Chairman Wexler turned back to the table, paper still in hand. No expression, no theatrics, just an old man reading the weather before announcing a storm. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat once, and began reading aloud. The event of project lead reassignment within 14 business days of the attached compliance report submission. All accountability, legal, operational, and regulatory, shall transfer to the initiating executive, per internal policy 2237F, subsection 9B. The words didn't echo, but they didn't need to. They landed like iron filings across the mahogany table, heavy and metallic and irreversible. Please see addendum signed by legal. Timestamp and verification chain enclosed. A sharp inhale broke the room's paralysis. Not dramatic, just someone, maybe Janice, realizing too late they'd forgotten to breathe. Wexler flipped the page. The soft rustle sounded deafening. This clause has been verified under the authority of the Compliance Review Office, co-signed by internal legal and observed by Audit and Risk Management on the date of September 6th. He paused. turned the page again, held up the last sheet like a judge holding a verdict. Signature, Karen Liu. Legal witness, Angela Reynolds. System timestamp, 14:59 EST, then silence. Angela re-entered the room at that exact moment, her phone still in her hand, but her face pale. "I just got off with legal," she said, not bothering to sit. "They confirm the addendum is valid." Karen added it during the March policy update. It was buried inside the compliance fallback doc that Greg had deprioritized. Her voice didn't even carry blame. It was just factual, terminal. Greg's chair groaned as he stood, hands flat on the table like he could push the truth back into the paper. "This is insane," he barked. "You're telling me she snuck in a clause that makes me liable for everything?" Angela looked at him. Not snuck in. Logged, signed, countersigned, reviewed. "But no one told me." "He wasn't obligated to," Wexler interrupted, still calmly. "You signed off on the handover and terminated the lead without review." Brett cleared his throat like a man trying to pretend he still had use in the conversation. "But the systems, everything's working right. We're not exposed." "I mean, we migrated to the new structure," Devin, still seated in the corner, spoke for the first time. "Actually, the systems have already failed the pre-review checklist." Brett's head whipped toward him. "What?" Devin tapped a file open on his laptop. 3 core systems missed their compliance snapshot deadlines. 2 were running in sandbox environments when they were supposed to be locked for review. 1 hasn't updated its audit trail since Karen's removal. Angela added, Apex Delta's withdrawal triggered a review freeze, but no one filed the override protocol. That's a Phase 2 violation. Greg stared at the screen. "Then fix it." "Can't backdate compliance," Angela said. "Not under Phase 2, that's the whole point. Once the review window opens, the system scans for any anomalies. And we've got anomalies," Devin finished. "A lot of them." A long, drawn-out moment passed where no one spoke. Only the hum of the HVAC and the slow, almost cruel tick of the analog clock above the whiteboard filled the room. Chairman Wexler took his seat at the head of the table, folded the memo precisely in thirds, placed it in front of him like a chess move completed. "Here's what happens next," he said, voice soft but final. "Greg, you'll remain seated. Brett, you'll return your badge. Legal will begin internal interviews. Compliance and IT will prepare Karen's systems for emergency restore. We'll contact her directly if she's willing to consult." Greg looked like he'd been tasered. "You're saying I'm accountable," Wexler said. "Not just per Karen's clause, now also per policy 12.4 under mismanagement of transitional compliance. You initiated the change. You own the outcome." Brett opened his mouth. Wexler didn't look at him, didn't need to. "You," he said flatly, "shouldn't have deleted the audit templates." Brett's face flushed, pale and blotchy all at once. "I didn't think that," Wexler said, "was the problem." The folder sat between them all now, still and damning. It didn't shout. It didn't accuse. It simply existed like gravity. Like fact. Karen's handwriting on the final page was neat, sharp. Fail-safes are for when egos override reason. Wexler didn't say another word. He just leaned back in his chair, watching Greg breathe too fast and Brett rub his palms against his pants like he could erase the last 2 weeks from memory. But the memo stayed. And so did the consequences. The room didn't explode. It imploded. No yelling. No fist pounding. Just a silence so thick it had mass. You could feel it pushing against your chest, making the air harder to breathe. Greg was frozen halfway through a sentence no one had asked for, lips slightly parted like he was buffering. Brett sat motionless, hands flat on the table, his face a shade of beige that matched the fake wood grain under his palms. Chairman Wexler leaned forward, and almost to himself, whispered the line that no executive ever wants to hear spoken at their own table. "My God, what have you done?" HR sprang into motion first. Phones came out, doors were closed, a whisper into a headset, a nod. Someone somewhere was about to be escorted out quietly, but not before signing a very long form. Legal followed. Angela stood up, smoothed her skirt, and gestured to Greg with one finger. "We need to speak." Privately. Her voice was flat, almost bored, the sound of a woman who had already drafted the email she never thought she'd have to send. Then another motion. "Brett, you too." Brett blinked. "Me? I didn't. You signed off on the override deletion." "It's in the logs," she said without looking at him. "We'll need a copy of your laptop." Now. Devin stood, unplugged his charger, and walked slowly toward the exit without being asked. He'd already forwarded Karen's last version of the recovery doc to IT with the subject line. Initiate restore, KL. Systems backup //auth code 73Q. The CTO, who hadn't spoken once during the meeting, pulled his phone from his blazer and made one call. "Start it," he said. Moments later, in the operations war room 3 floors down, junior IT analyst clicked a command that unlocked a compressed archive labeled Karen Core Backup Final V2. Zip, the system blinked. A loading bar appeared, a faint beep, and then something miraculous. One by one, the dashboards that had gone black flickered back to life. Audit trails recompiled, permissions restructured, compliance snapshots realigned with their original timelines. It was like the company itself exhaled. Upstairs, in the conference room, Greg still hadn't moved. He sat with his tie crooked, sweat blotching through his shirt under the arms. His fingers were trembling, not fast, just enough to be noticeable. Wexler didn't look at him. He didn't need to. The old man just stared at the screen at the far end of the room where the system reboot had finished. It sat now on the default login page. One name glowed at the top, restored by protocol. Karen Liu project owner Brett tried to laugh, came out like a cough. Angela returned, handed him a printed copy of the legal clause again. "You signed this. Page 8. Right under the phrase, responsibility for Phase 2 cannot be transferred post-trigger without written board consent. But I was told it was just a formality." She looked at him with dead eyes. "You were told wrong." At 11:41 a.m., Karen's archived credentials were activated in consultant mode, just long enough for a clone of her recovery script to be loaded into production. No one needed her login. The code had already been written. The logs showed the last timestamp of activity under her credentials from weeks ago. The system didn't care that she was gone. It only cared that she'd been there, and now she wasn't. Karen was somewhere deep in a forest trail outside of Asheville. Elevation, 3,800 feet. Cell reception, non-existent. Had a thermos of coffee, a notebook with no lines, and a pencil she liked better than any keyboard. A mossy boulder made for a fine seat. Birds chirped. Her boots were muddy. Her thoughts were clean. Her phone buzzed once, just enough signal for a single message to crawl through. From Margaret Exec Admin to Chairman Wexler, would you be open to a consulting role? Flexible terms, priority access, his request. Karen didn't check it. She wouldn't for hours. Maybe longer. Back in the conference room, Greg still hadn't stood. The others had gone. HR had taken Brett down another hallway. Angela was debriefing with legal. Even Wexler had disappeared after a final statement. "Fix it, if you can. But this isn't just a cleanup. This is a reckoning." Now Greg sat alone. His chair tilted slightly back, his eyes hollow, hands limp at his sides. The projector screen glowed in front of him, filling the room with a sterile blue light. He stared at it like a man waiting for someone to turn it off, only no one would. On the screen, the dashboard loaded fully. Top right corner, Phase 2 audit on schedule, system owner, Karen Liu underneath it, a blinking cursor. Alive, ready, waiting. Greg didn't blink. He just whispered something to no one, and the screen blinked back. Thanks for joining the fun, you office survivors. Subscribe for more switch-flicking drama. Let's make your former coworkers sweat.